don't know me, my name is Chloe. For those of you who may know me but don't know what I do, here at Quest, I primarily oversee our community life and local justice work, which is why I'm up here this morning once again to talk to you about the importance of community and justice. I'm like a telemarketer that won't stop calling you, but instead of trying to sell you life insurance, I'm just trying to sell you on becoming an activist. I'm like, for the low price of $19.99, you too can undo systemic racism. But truly, I really am excited to be preaching this morning. And I'm excited because as we close out our Faith and Race series, I do believe that God is calling our church to open our hearts and our minds to the way God is moving in this congregation for such a time as this. I believe God is calling our church to have a radical imagination for what is possible when we step into the story of love, justice, and action that God has been weaving in and through the people of God. If you haven't been with us for the last 3 weeks, as Pastor Aaron shared, we've been in our Faith and Race series talking about immigration and the injustices facing immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. I will speak for myself in saying that I have been so moved by all of the voices that we have heard, the information that has been presented, the personal stories that have been shared. For those of you who have been able to come to the sermons or the workshops, I don't know about you, but for me, I am left with this profound sense of unsettledness. Because to sit in this building and to hear stories about parents with young children being deported, to hear about immigration attorneys being harassed for doing their jobs, folks who've been in this country for 20 years carrying around their passport just in case they get stopped by ICE. I cannot sit here, take that all in, and then go home and wash my hands of this mess. No, I don't think we can afford to, because we should never be able to disconnect our hearts from what we hear and we see. These stories, these injustices, they unsettle us. And they unsettle us because what is happening in this country and what is happening in this world around us, it is not of God. I look at social media, I read the news occasionally, and I do not see the reflection of a good and gracious God who calls us to the simple and yet seemingly impossible command to love our neighbor. And so what do we do as the people of God when something is not of God? We look for where God is, and we do everything we can to move closer to them. So church, this morning, I want to talk about how we move towards God in this moment as a people. I talk about justice a lot, and I will probably say that word every time I stand on this stage because it's a word that speaks so deeply to the desires of my soul. But this morning, I don't want to just talk about justice as something that we believe in with our hearts or our minds. I want to talk about justice as something that we do with our hands and our feet. In the streets, in the church basements, in City Hall, at the state capitol. I'm talking about what it looks like to organize people of faith for the pursuit of justice. I'm talking about community organizing, grassroots activism. And if those are phrases that sound scary to you, just stay with me this morning. See, in the church I grew up in, I was encouraged to separate my faith from my politics. And yet somehow that same church still gave out voter guides every election that told people how to vote from a Christian perspective. That same church openly encouraged folks to sign a petition opposing gay marriage on Sunday mornings. And so my primary experience of seeing the church be political was in a way that did harm. And so I overreacted, and I started to believe that community organizing, grassroots movements, activism, those are things that happen outside of the church. And if I want to get involved in those kinds of movements, then I have to put my faith in my back pocket because it felt like there was no room for my spirituality out in the streets. But Quest, I'm going to make the bold declaration this morning that God is a political God. Because politics dictate the way that we protect and care for our neighbors and advocate for our communities. And what is more godly than caring for our neighbor? And so to reclaim the position of the church and the role of community organizing and the role of collective action for systemic change. Because y'all, the church has always been in the pews and in the streets. From Cesar Chavez organizing priests to stand in solidarity with Mexican and Filipino farm workers in the 60s, to the meetings held in church basements in Alabama during the civil rights movement, the church has and will always be a catalyst for organized movements towards political and social change. Community organizing, for those who may still feel apprehensive about that term, at its core is gathering people together, setting goals, and enacting those goals together. Y'all, what do we do in this church week to week? We come together. We set goals. Maybe it's goals of developing small groups, collecting items for travel kits, tithing, whatever those goals are, and we enact those goals together. The church is a prime place for organizing. We've been talking about immigration for 3 weeks, but we aren't just talking about immigration because we want to check off the box to say that we learned something new about the oppression happening in this country. No, we're talking about immigration because we need to see large-scale changes to policy and systems that impact immigrant communities. Because we need more local investment in supporting and advocating for immigrants at a time when the government is abdicating its responsibility to care for the tired, the poor, the huddled masses. I'm not here this morning to tell you exactly how to start community organizing. Unless y'all want to stay for a really, really long sermon, but we kind of already catch flack for long services, so I don't think anybody wants that. But what I'm wanting to invite us to consider is that the Bible we read, the scriptures we seek to apply to our lives, they actually teach us about community organizing. That to talk about addressing political, systemic, and structural injustices through building power, challenging government entities, rewriting law and policy, even that is biblical. And so to do so, I'm going to bring us to the book of Numbers. Now, there are so many complex social and political issues unfolding in the stories of the Old Testament that are often overlooked. I gotta say, I'm probably one of the few queer people who has a really good relationship with the Old Testament. I mean, me and Leviticus, we're like this. But any time that I get to dig into an obscure Old Testament passage to make a connection to modern day struggles, I will jump at that opportunity. So stay with me, because I'm going to do just a little bit of biblical analysis, but I'm going to go slow, and mostly I hope that in this brief time that we have together this morning, we can see that the stories of thousands of years ago are the stories of today. Yes. And I think this story is one that will resonate with many of us. It's an important story of collective organizing, of challenging systems, and of God's solidarity with the oppressed. In fact, it's a story that's so important that the main characters of this story are mentioned in 5 different places in the Old Testament, and only the prophets Miriam and Moses are mentioned in more different books in the Old Testament. So let's set the scene in the book of Numbers. The Israelites, having been set free from Egypt, are wandering about the desert towards the promised land. And in the midst of the people, there's this man named Zelophehad. Now, don't get too attached to Zelophehad, because spoiler alert, he dies. But Zelophehad had 5 daughters: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. Now, a brief detour into ancient law. The people of Israel were allotted land in the promised land according to the names of the second generation, but the census only counted and named men. Shocker. So when my guy Zelophehad dies with no sons to inherit his land, it seems the land will be taken away from his family, and specifically his daughters. Now let's turn to the text to see what these 5 women, Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, do. Hear now the word of God from Numbers 27, 1 through 11. Then the daughters of Zelophehad came forward. Zelophehad was son of Hepher, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, of the clans of Manasseh, son of Joseph. The names of his daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting, saying, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the congregation of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the congregation of Korah, but died for his own sin, and he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give to us a possession among our father's brothers." Moses brought their case before the Lord, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "The daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they are saying. You shall indeed let them possess an inheritance among their father's brothers, and pass the inheritance of their father on to them. You shall also speak to the Israelites, saying, if a man dies and has no son, you shall pass his inheritance on to his daughter. If he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the nearest kinsman of his clan, and he shall possess it. It shall be for the Israelites a statute and ordinance, as the Lord commanded Moses. This is the word of God for the people of God. So you're probably looking at me right now like, you just said this would be relatable, and then you just read a bunch of verses about Israel inheritance law, so I'm a little confused, which, so fair. Stay with me. I'm right there with you. But what I believe this text is giving us, the people of God, years in the future, is a model for what it looks like to fight against systemic oppression and to trust in God's goodness and justice. See, from this story, I want to break down 3 principles of community organizing that can guide us as Christians. And whether you see yourself as a community organizer or not, these principles are helpful in shaping how we approach justice when we work together towards collective action. And I assure you that justice is always easier when we do it together. In these principles, I also want to share some stories from my experience with community organizing amongst churches and Christians. And I don't share these stories because I'm some kind of expert in community organizing or because I have all the answers. Y'all, I literally turned 25 next week. My brain is not even fully developed. It's still cooking. But rather, I tell you these stories to empower you to see that each of you can be an organizer in your own way. I didn't know what organizing was until I was 22 years old, and I was simply faced with a problem that was hurting my community, and I wanted to do something to change it. How many of us find ourselves in those kinds of situations every day? Labor activist Dolores Huerta said, "Every moment is an organizing opportunity. Every person a potential activist. Every minute a chance to change the world." And so, Quest, I empower you to see yourself in these stories, in the story of the Bible, in the stories of a clueless 20-something-year-old trying to figure out how to organize. Because the only way through this moment in our country, in our history, is to recognize the capacity that each of us has to be a change maker in our community when we work together. So our story in Numbers begins with these 5 women, Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah, identifying an injustice that has been done to them. See, the law will not allow them to inherit their father's land. Nobody else calls attention to this injustice. Moses, Eleazar, the chiefs, they don't seem to be sitting around worrying about whether or not Israel's inheritance laws account for daughters whose fathers die with no male heir. But these women, with their lived experience, come together to bring this issue to the attention of those in power. And they don't come and ask politely. No, they don't mince words or try to play both sides. They demand that they be given their father's land. Movements for justice, collective action, they must always be led from below. It's the first principle. These movements must be led by those who are most affected by the injustice being perpetuated. Now, we're in Seattle. Y'all ever walked into a discussion or a meeting about racial justice and you realize there's not a single person of color in that room? Yeah, I know I have. And that's not to say that white folks should not be involved in the struggle. We need to be allies in this work. Actually, more than allies, I recently heard somebody here say that we need to be accomplices in the work. But we always have to consider whose voices are being centered in community work. Whose leadership are we following? And I get that we're eager to be accomplices, myself included. I mean, this entire Faith and Race series is about immigration, but I myself am not an immigrant. That is not my story. But it is the story of so many people in our congregation. And so I pray as we continue forward in this work, as we seek to stay proximate to immigration as a church, that those are the voices being centered. That your voice will influence our workshop this afternoon, our work next week for the Day of Action, our work for the year to come. Not in a way that's exploiting your voice, not tokenizing your voice, but empowering your voice. Because I promise you that we cannot do any kind of effective organizing work if we are not led by the people most affected by the problem. I was at a training recently for nonviolent civil disobedience in a church basement, which is one of the most Seattle liberal phrases I can say. But it was in fact one of those scenarios where I looked around and I realized that most of the folks in the room were white. And somebody pointed this out during the Q&A, and the person leading in the training, a black man, paused and said something that has stuck with me. He said, "There is not a single movement in history wherein the oppressed people have been able to sit out their own liberation." I'm going to say that one more time. There is not a single movement in history wherein the oppressed people have been able to sit out their own liberation. I understand the weight of oppression feels insurmountable sometimes. There are times when, as oppressed and marginalized people, we need to take that big step back and care for ourselves. But what he said is true. We cannot sit out our own liberation. And here's the thing, most of us face some kind of obstacle in our life. Whether it's class, gender, ability, sexuality, race, geography, ethnicity, culture, we each have a story that compels us for why we get involved in justice work. We often talk about getting more proximity to the problems we want to solve, to learn from the people in our community with lived experience. And that is important when we approach organizing as allies. But instead of always seeking to get proximity to a problem that doesn't speak to your specific lived experience, also consider what problems you are already proximate to. What areas of your lived experience empower you to care? There are so many issues facing us as a people, and we can get frozen trying to solve them all. The hardest lesson that I have had to accept is that I cannot solve every problem. But if we figure out where we have voice and power to lead, then it helps us narrow down where we can be the most effective. It's why most organizing work always begins with having conversations with the people in your community to determine what issues are actually affecting your community. As I mentioned, my first organizing experience was when I was 22, and the only reason that I stumbled into organizing is because I was a queer student at a college that discriminated against queer people. Well, actually, to be fair, I didn't really realize I was queer when I started that. Up until like halfway through, I just thought I was a really passionate ally, which is like a rite of passage if you really think about it for a lot of queer people. If you've ever been there, just know that I see you. And I know that Chapel Roan's Good Luck Babe was in your top songs on Spotify. Pastor Aaron Chapel Roan is, I'll explain it later. I digress. Even though I was the only person within a 10-mile radius who didn't know I was queer at that time, it was still that identity and that proximity that called me into organizing, that compelled me to say, I will do whatever I can to change this college and change these systems so that people like me don't have to suffer here. And that same call propelled dozens of other students until we had a critical mass to organize with. And the only reason we had any kind of sustained organizing towards queer rights at that college is because it was led by queer students. So if you're an ally or an accomplice, submit to the leadership of those who are most affected by the problem in this work. But if you are the most affected, be empowered to know that your voice, your body, your experience is needed in order to change these systems. And we cannot sit out our own liberation. The next principle of community organizing that I'd love to talk about from this story is that you have to change systems, not just people. One of the most compelling parts of the story in Numbers to me, and I get really, really excited about this, is that when Moses brings Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah's complaint to God, starting in verse 5, not only does God respond to Moses by saying, give them their property, no, God goes a step further and declares, you shall also speak to the Israelites and say. In that moment, in God commanding Moses to speak to the Israelites, God moves from an individual change to a systemic change. God moves from an act of mercy into a restructuring of society. And this is cemented when the text says, it shall be for the Israelites a statute and an ordinance, as the Lord commanded. How often have we been told to never question laws as they are interpreted to us, and yet in this moment, God receives these women's challenge and responds by expanding the application of the law so that future generations will be entitled to the same rights as these women. Any justice work that we do, from the marches to the petitions to the discussions, must be centered on changing systems. I love the example that our guest preacher, Director Medard, used a couple weeks ago when talking about the parable of the Good Samaritan. See, we can flip a coin to the beggar. We could take the man on the side of the street in to treat his wounds. But what if we ask what needs to be done about the road to Jericho so that this doesn't happen again? Maybe we need criminal justice reform for the robbers. Maybe we need investment in better roads to prevent people from getting beat down on them. Where are the opportunities to change systems so that future generations don't suffer the same injustice? Let me be so real with y'all right now. There is no part of me that wants to spend these next 4 years having to simply react to every executive order and action that man in office and his henchmen try to pass. I don't want to spend the rest of my life scrambling to react to a broken political system. What does it look like instead to invest our time and energy into advocating for and working towards new systems that actually protect people? To organize for political and social systems that aren't rooted in colonialism and white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism. Architect Richard Buckminster said this: "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And it's hard. I get it. It probably sounds like I'm just speaking in dreams. Meanwhile, there are immediate needs in front of us that we need to address, and it's a hard balance to find. Balancing the need for investment in long-term system change and the constant crisis of how these systems hurt people right now is difficult. For example, for the last year, I've been a part of a team of churches trying to organize around creating more housing access for asylum seekers. And this organizing campaign started because last year, there were entire communities of newly arriving asylum seekers living in tents in Kent without access to housing. We were working towards a sustainable solution. So for months, we'd been working towards developing a campaign that would address this issue of housing access, but we were organizing churches in Seattle to build our power and capacity. We weren't necessarily in the camps in Kent and on the ground addressing the immediate needs and the crises that were arising there. And so we had this one meeting in the fall, and we managed to connect with some of the organizers and asylum seekers who were in Kent, and we invited them to our planning meeting. As we sat around talking about our long-term goals of building power and activating churches, these folks got increasingly and visibly frustrated. And at one point, they finally stood up and they shared that they needed money and resources right now for people who were sleeping outside and they had no idea where they were going to go next. They needed housing that night for a girl who had asthma and couldn't breathe in the camp. And y'all, I was frozen because I understood their frustration. I understood that there were immediate needs that needed to be addressed, and a bunch of people sitting at a church in Ballard with our catered Chipotle talking about our grand ideas of building housing, that probably felt like a waste of time and energy. And so my heart was torn. And yet we need both. We need the people who are on the ground addressing the immediate needs. We need the Good Samaritan treating the wounds of the man on the road, but we also need people who are repaving the road itself. We need the people who are serving meals to our unhoused neighbors, but we also need people who are advocating to City Council for a budget that prioritizes funding food banks and meal programs. We need the people who pack kits for world relief, but we also need the people who are writing letters to their representatives advocating for the state to allocate more funding to support newly arriving immigrants. How many of you know that we're in the middle of a legislative budget season in Washington, and we need people advocating for more avenues for progressive revenue so that our state can continue to fund crucial programs that protect our neighbors? We need to be thinking about how we, the people of God, are doing justice in a way that creates more long-term solutions. In policy change and shifting systems and structures, we need a justice shaped around a God who says, "And now say to all my people." Organizing requires changing systems so that we don't always have to react to the next injustice, but rather so that we can build towards the justice we want to see. And that leads to my last principle from this story, which is this: we must learn how to sustain the struggle. Remember how I said that the women of this story are mentioned in more books in the Old Testament than anyone else? Here's why. Because their story doesn't end in Numbers 27. Even though we clearly read that God commands Moses to do right by these women, guess what? Moses never gives them the inheritance that they were promised. In fact, Moses dies without ever fulfilling the command that God gave to him. So we fast forward to Joshua 17, 3-4, and we encounter these women once again, and the text says this: "The daughters approached Eleazar the priest, Joshua, Nun's son, and the leaders. They said, 'The Lord commanded Moses to give us a legacy along with our male relatives.' So in agreement with the Lord's command, they were given a legacy along with their uncles. Now, finally, Mala, Noah, Hagla, Milcah, and Tirzah get the justice that was promised to them. I wish I could tell you that systemic issues that stem from decades and centuries of white supremacy, colonization, patriarchy, capitalism, that these issues will be solved in one protest or one movement in one generation. That's not how change happens. Activist Dorothy Day said, "We must lay one brick at a time, take one step at a time." And so maybe one of the harder things about justice work is to recognize that we don't always get what we want when we need it. And that we don't always have the ability to see that justice unfolds in movements, not in moments. And that's hard for me. I'm somebody who's very goal-oriented, and I'm Gen Z, so instant gratification is just a part of my culture. And it's been tough to realize that just because you get 2,000 signatures on a petition, or you make a super viral TikTok protesting your college and Mark Ruffalo tweets about you, none of that means that immediately you're gonna get what you're fighting for. And maybe you do, and that's great. We need wins like that. But more often than not, organizing and justice work requires us to find the strength to keep pushing forward, even when we face opposition, even when we grow weary, and yes, even when we fail. Last fall, Quest joined with some other churches who were coming together to do advocacy around the Seattle city budget process. And so I'd go to these city council meetings and watch literally hundreds of people give public comments opposing the mayor's plan to use money that had been set aside for affordable housing to instead fund proposed increases to the policing budget. And when it came time for the final vote on that budget, I sat in a nearly empty room at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday as the city council passed a budget that directly contradicted what a majority of people were advocating for. I watched as one member of city council broke down in tears at how she felt the council had failed their constituents. Folks had put in hours showing up to those meetings, writing letters, advocating, and we lost, and it hurt. And then just last month, I was with another pastor who was a part of this organizing group down in Olympia, and we ran into one of those members of city council. And he actually remembered our faces from those meetings. And as we talked about what had happened last fall, he said to us this. He said, "I hope that you guys come back because we need your advocacy." Because even though we didn't get what we wanted in that budget process, we don't get to give up because there's another process this fall. We don't get to crash out and burn everything that we are fighting for to the ground. No, we keep coming back and we keep fighting and we keep making our demands known until we get justice. That is sustaining the struggle. Many of us may have spent a majority of last year emotionally preparing for 4 years of our first woman president. We may have phone banked, we may have got out the vote, we may have put up signs and wore pins. And instead, we're back in the trenches trying to hold on to the last threads of our democracy. And it hurts. But then I consider the context from which we are fighting. My father was born in 1954, which means that when my father was born as a black man, he didn't have the right to vote. There are likely people in this congregation whose grandparents were placed in Japanese internment camps. And I say this to say that we are not even a generation removed from some of our country's most racist history. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do, but we can't give up. St. Francis of Assisi said this: "We start by doing what's necessary. Then we do what's possible, and suddenly you're doing the impossible." It will take strength to keep doing this work that feels impossible. But as a person of faith, I am grateful that I don't have to rely on my own strength. No, my strength comes from the Lord. I don't know about you guys, because if the only source of strength I had to turn to was my own, then I would give up. If the only hope that Mala, Noah, Hagla, Milcah, and Tirzah had was their own, maybe they would have given up too. But they stood strong in the knowledge that the Lord had demanded and commanded that they would be given justice. And so I say that to us all this morning. May we stand in the strength of knowing that the Lord has commanded and demanded that we will be given justice. And may that knowledge sustain us. So as I prepare to close today, I have a secret. And the secret is that I actually have one more principle. And that is to know the history of those who came before you. Now, I understand that we look at the state of the American church today and we see a whole lot of bad. We see the co-opting of Scripture for the oppression of the most marginalized. We see Christian nationalism. But furthermore, it may be unsettling, we see apathy. We see churches shut their doors on Sunday morning and pretend as if what is happening in this country is not happening to the people of God. But church, I say to you this morning, that is not the whole story. In every season, in every generation, the church has been a voice in the movement towards social progress. From the preachers who led the civil rights movement, to the ordained women at the head of the suffragette movement, to the queer ministers who helped orchestrate the very first Pride Parade, the church has never been absent in the fight for justice. But the strategic silencing of the church's impact has served those in power by making us feel that we have to choose between our faith and our action, our convictions and our sacraments. But we do not have to choose. I think that there's sometimes this tendency to want to believe that we're always doing something new. We want to think of ourselves as innovators, that we're paving a new path forward, and sometimes I think that we can fall into that here at Quest. And I don't want to say that Quest is not a special church, but I do not think that it always benefits us to tell ourselves that we are the only church who can do this. No, what is more empowering is to recognize that we are stepping into the legacy of churches who came before us, partnering with churches who are walking alongside us in this work, and we know that we are not alone. This is not an ancient history of church activism and community organizing. It is a story that is still being written. It is a story being written by Galileo Church in Kendall, Texas, who in 2023 launched the North Texas Transportation Network, a nonprofit that provides travel grants to families seeking out-of-state health care for trans and gender-diverse minors. It's a story being written by a collection of churches in Florida who founded Faith in Florida in 2024 to provide Black history lessons in their churches on Saturday mornings for students in Florida public schools after the state cracked down on teaching Black history. It's a story being written by churches right here in Seattle who've been pushing for decades to change development laws so that religious organizations can more easily convert their land into affordable housing developments to address the city's housing crisis. This is the church in action. This is community organizing. This is collective action. And so I hope that we can have a bigger imagination for what we mean when we say that we do justice. That we expand our imagination for what the church can do and what the church can be when we come together and we realize the power that we have. I don't stand up here because I like the sound of my own voice. Trust me, I would much rather be sitting in the back there. But rather, I stand up here because I have a deep conviction that God is calling the church to stand up in this moment, to take up space, to boldly fight and push for justice in systems and in politics and in structures, just like Mala, Noah, Hagla, Milka, and Tirza. And so here is my final invitation to you. Come to today's Faith and Race workshop. Come to our Day of Action service next Sunday. Now, I am excited about today's Faith and Race workshop, but I will confess that what we'll be doing won't exactly be systemic policy change. So if you're fired up about that stuff, please do come find me and talk to me because I'd love to chat. But rather, what we'll be doing in today's workshop is taking that first baby step towards imagining what our church, as a collective people, has to offer towards the tangible work of welcoming the stranger. To dip our toes into the waters of community organizing by identifying what our community can actually do to activate our resources and our knowledge to make a tangible difference with an organization that needs our help in our neighborhood. We won't build new systems in one afternoon, but we will build our church's capacity to do this work and to do it together and to do it well. It's about starting somewhere. And I hope that you'll come to church next weekend for our first Day of Action service. Yes, we'll be packing travel kits for immigrants leaving the Northwest Detention Center, but we'll also be writing letters to our state representatives and advocating for our newly arriving immigrant neighbors. It's just another baby step forward for our church for what it looks like to do justice in this moment and at this time in our country. We can fall into despair at what's happening around us. I know I have. And it's okay to rest in that despair for a little bit. But church, let me assure you this morning that you have more power than you know. And that your power is found when you come out of your own head and you join hands with the person next to you. That your power is found in our power. that like Mala, Noah, Hagla, Milcah, and Tirzah, we can change systems and we will get justice. That is the call of the church at this moment. Let me close in prayer. God of justice, love, and mercy, we call on you to move in and through your people today and for the days to come. May you give us the courage of Mala to stand up to systems of oppression. May you give us the voice of Noah to advocate for our needs and the needs of our neighbors. May you give us the audacity of Hagla to believe that a better world is not only possible, but promised. May you give us the love of Milcah to see the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. May you give us the strength of Tirzah to never stop fighting until justice is won. In your power, amen.